Sega Saturn is not only here now, it's out there.
As so often happens with the big companies, when they have a really successful product and try to repeat the success, they forget what it was that made them successful. And what made the Genesis successful was Sega's willingness to work with third-party developers to produce software. On the Saturn, they were a lot less willing, or a lot less. They had been on top with the Genesis, and they got kind of arrogant.
I did not want to do this, and I was ordered to, so I did. I couldn't wait any longer, even though we didn't have enough or very many good games.
It's 1995. At the beginning of the year, Robert Leyland and his crew of experienced game designers were working on a fully 3D shooter. Having made several Genesis games, Sega tasked them with making an action game exclusively for their next console.
We did a game called Racing Aces, which was an airplane racing game using 3D terrain, which is kind of hard to do on the Genesis, but we'd kind of pulled it off. So showing some technical prowess, they put us on the Saturn console.
Jumpin' Jack Software's project, Ghen would launch with the Saturn on September 2nd. It's a mech shooter in space, where most of your weapons are explosives. At a developers conference in February, they showed off the 3D game's progress, and more importantly, its polygonal terrain.
And that kind of wowed the audience. People were pretty happy to see that, because I think up until that time, people were concerned that the Saturn couldn't do 3D at all. So when they saw that we were getting terrain flyovers and like textured polygon terrain, people were a lot more confident that the system could perform. It was just that yes, it could do that, but you were pushing uphill to get it to do that.
Since 3D games and the Saturn's hardware are still uncharted territory, they needed lots of time and concentration to do it right. But Leyland says Sega and their management structure got in the way. From the beginning of Ghen War's development, Leyland's team ran into problems largely out of their control. The programming manuals American developers first got were poorly translated from Japanese. Top that off with this being an unreleased console using new graphics. They had to figure out a lot of it on their own. Perhaps the biggest problem: the first polygon engine Sega's leaders wrote for Saturn struggled with 3D. The hardware is technologically capable of pulling off stunning polygon graphics, but most early developers were not given the right tools to make it happen.
Their management wouldn't bend and get a decent polygon engine. Rumors were that they were trying to, and I know several people wrote, several of the developers, and including us, wrote them and said, hey, look, this is a flaw. This is not a good design. This needs to be fixed. And by the time we got to that point, it was already, I think, a little too late.
Then in May, Sega dropped the ultimate communication bombshell.
We started our rollout of Sega Saturn yesterday.
Nobody really had time to react. It was more like, they're what? But I thought we were going to be a launch title.
They got ready to launch the Saturn on the 11th at E3. A surprise release nearly 4 months before September 2nd. Sega did not give a proper warning to most stores, journalists, and even Leyland's team, the group that was promised a launch game.
He let us know, I think, like maybe 2 days before, and we were like, okay.
You guys were kind of spending more energy on Sega's shortcomings with their console and their help with developers than the actual game itself. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely.
Ghen wouldn't come out until sometime in October, according to both a Sega Vision's release schedule and Game Fan's review. This makes it the Saturn's second Doom clone, and one of the first to use polygon environments and enemies, long before Quake came out.
Creamy 3D graphics.
Unfortunately, spending more time dealing with Sega than refining the game really shows in the final product. But the smart level design, explosive action sequences, large enemies, and intense music can make it fun. Question is, does the good outweigh the bad?
It's PandaMonium!
It's the future. Humans allowed an armada of Ghen refugees to make Earth their temporary home. They're hiding from the Bo-Kayat, the super race they're at war with. As thanks, the Ghen gave every human an implant that cures all diseases, started helping them mine rare resources, and drastically improved their science and technology.
Jenner here.
Earth Probe 1, Reynolds here.
Proceed.
The plot plays out in FMV cutscenes, since this is an action game in the 90s. It's like watching a campy 90s sci-fi movie.
Oh, and by the way, when do I get that dinner you promised me on Archon 7?
Keep your comments to yourself, Reynolds.
It starts on the Saturn Moon Titan, perhaps a reference to Sega's Saturn and their Titan video arcade board.
I'm detecting strontium activity to the north, sir.
Strontium here?
The signals are intensifying.
While mining for resources, Ghen teammates disappear and unexpectedly turn against the humans. Your main characters are a team of space engineers. You assume the role of the lieutenant, whose face is never seen.
You, Lieutenant, follow me.
You have the hardened leader, robot data man, comms guy from Earth, somewhat level-headed pilot girl, and the non-level-headed, uncomfortably eccentric flyboy. Yeehaw.
Yeehaw. Then what are we waiting for?
While attacking your crew, the Ghen blow up Titan, Galactic Empire style. They control the minds of nearly everyone back home.
We're all looking forward to your arrival here on Earth.
Since this team is among the few people who know what the Ghen are up to, humanity is effectively in their hands. They must destroy the Gen's forces in our solar system while making their way back to Earth. The plot hints at a few Ghen rebels helping the humans back home. This was not even the original plot. Leyland says he and Greg Hammond wrote a script, and Hollywood gave them something else.
They redid the whole story concept completely. And unfortunately, Hollywood's idea of science fiction at that time began and ended with mind control and the puppet masters.
You are hereby ordered to cease all offensive and harmful actions against the Ghen.
He tells me the concept of betrayal is common with both plot lines. Humans were still helping the alien race who were running in fear of the Bo-Kayat. But in their original script, the Ghen were secretly scouts for the bad guys.
The book was better.
They wanted this game to focus on fighting the Ghen, so the potential sequel would focus on fighting the Bo-Kayat. Another thing that got scrapped, it was written in a way that made it a choose-your-own adventure. The playthrough would branch out into different paths depending on what the player did, and if they won or lost certain missions. Ultimately, they decided to stick with a linear game. On the disc, there's an unused file called villain.avi, which appears to be a bad ending.
I hate it when people say there's nothing to worry about.
Recognize this band? You should. It's the Bygone Dogs from Cyber Speedway. You start the game on Venus for a training mission. It's a great opportunity to get used to the controls and test out your weapons. You can leave the training mission at any time with no consequences. Nothing carries over. The cockpit of your hypersuit shows things like your health, speed, and what kind of weapons you have activated. Lasers, your default weapon, have unlimited ammo, but they do drain the red energy meter to the left. Jumping and speed boosting also drained it. It recharges quickly, but you will notice it run dry all the time. I personally think the lasers shouldn't drain the energy meter, but that's just me. You cycle through your missiles, explosives, and other sub-weapons by pressing Z for the next weapon, or holding Z while pressing L and R to scroll back and forth. Only the manual tells you about holding Z, and that makes toggling your weapons a hell of a lot easier.
We're going to Mars.
The first stage is on Mars, putting you through 4 missions. Right away, you face off against 2 Ghen grunts and some small flying drones. These standard enemies are easy to kill with the laser. They all have unique objectives. Sometimes it's as simple as killing all the enemies, but most of them are pretty creative. Mission 3's goal is to blow up a refinery. To do this, you have to find a rare mining explosive, requiring some exploration. In Mission 1, you have to find and destroy the force field's power source and get to the exit in the northwest. Of course, since this is on a 90s console, movement is accomplished with tank controls. The player's reticle locks onto enemies in front of you. This makes shooting at them a little easier. Missiles will home in on whatever you're locked to. Larger tanks, turrets, and stronger grunts are sprinkled across the maps. These are easier to take down with missiles, but sometimes you lock onto enemy projectiles instead of the enemy itself. Since there's no way to control the lock-on, you'll occasionally have to battle the reticle instead of the enemy. One control option I like quite a bit is the X button. Pressing it instantly makes you do a 180 turn. This has always made tank controls more palatable and becomes a useful reflex in Ghen War. In true 5th gen fashion, strafing is faster than going straight. One of the game's claims to fame is using deformable terrain. Certain parts of the mountains and cave walls can get blown away and deformed by shooting at them. In the first level, it's marked with green texture. Leyland tells me the coloring was to teach the player that some terrain can be shot at. Pro Panda tip! At the end of Mission 1, there's an extra life hiding in the left side of the deformable green wall. Leyland believes Ghen War is the first 3D game to have deformable terrain at this level of complexity. This type of missile is designed specifically for mountain moving, but they're also useful against enemies in tight spaces. This really plays into the plot theme of your team being resource miners forced into combat.
And we'll just have to stop them ourselves.
Whoa, 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 whoa. Who do you think we are? Superheroes? I mean, we're a bunch of surface engineers, Jenner. What are we gonna do, core sample them to death?
Superheroes. I believe I'll need a processor upgrade for that.
Mars Mission 2 puts you in a winding cave. You must destroy a reactor, free prisoners, and blow up all the tanks. This forces you to find a balance between looking at the map and looking at what's in front of you. On the HUD, it shows you where you've already traveled with the blue path. Unfortunately, the white dots are not color-coded. Anything that moves and any collectible item all look the same here. The pause screen shows you the whole map and your percentage for Ghen killed and goals completed. I found myself looking at the map quite a bit thanks to the really short draw distance. Your lock-on reticle can cut through the fog and let you know if there's an enemy beyond the dark. But even with this, the short draw distance can get infuriating. Leyland tells me they had to keep it short in order for the Saturn to maintain a consistent frame rate. In their defense, this seemed to work. I didn't notice that much slowdown while playing, but I did find myself staring down the map while trying to find things. If you got worried about hearing the bygone dogs at the start menu, leave those fears behind. The in-game music is awesome. Brian Coburn is both the sound designer and composer. He worked on the sound for Doom's 32 export. Coburn's music seems to take a lot of hints from Nine Inch Nails, System Shock, and the sci-fi soundtracks of the 90s. He managed to pull off dynamic tracks. When the player isn't being attacked, the music is slow, calm, and ambient. Once enemies start to flock, the music gets intense, more thumpy and fast-paced. When I listened to the sound files straight off the CD, I found out the dynamic soundtrack is accomplished by mixing the left and right channels. The slower music is heard in the left, while the intense is on the right. Ghen War appears to be programmed to fade between the left and right tracks in mono during the game. Enemies start in the same place every time you load into the level, but they do travel. Things like the tanks, grunts, and spiders can move over walls you can't jump over, oftentimes surprising or flanking you in areas you wouldn't expect. Sometimes you can even see them go out of bounds. If you try to run, they might follow you, even when you think you've lost sight of them. For an early 3D game, the AI is programmed in a way that can terrify the player, right after tripping into a false sense of security. They're smart. Moments between combat left me on the edge of my seat, knowing I could be attacked at any moment. Most of your sub-weapons are explosions, and ammo's relatively easy to find. This makes combat really fun at times. You can see me lead a few Ghen captains into this small area, launch a bunch of grenades in there, and watch them burn from a safe distance. There's also these decoys, which fool enemies into thinking they're you. They don't shoot anything, but they do work. Different types of missiles vary in speed and power. The downside to having all these sub-weapons is time spent scrolling through them. When you're in a real bind, surrounded by vicious enemies, It can be difficult to get to the right weapon before losing too much health. As long as you know to hold Z and press L and R, it's not too bad, but there were several moments where the speed at which I could swap weapons was not fast enough to keep up with the action. I really started to notice this in the moon levels, feeling more bogged down by the control scheme than the challenge of the enemies themselves. The missions and enemies are well designed, but it seems like they were made for the precision of a keyboard and mouse, something a Saturn gamepad has no way of achieving. When you finish Mars, you're treated to a fun, simple mission on Deimos, where you have to kill every Ghen on the map.
We're going to the moon.
Then you get to Earth's moon. The enemies evolve into larger, more complex-looking creatures and get way more ferocious. Ghen have taken over Moonbase, so the 5 missions have you break your way into its entrance and take out the enemies from inside. Getting inside is the hard part. In Moon Mission 1, there's this large boss-like enemy near the exit. You must collect 20 power cells to blow up a nuclear detonator, which kills the big boss and destroys the force field, allowing passage into Moonbase. Swarms of Ghen captains, tanks, and other crawlers guard the 20 power cells. The captains are brutal. These bullet sponges deal a lot of damage and zigzag away from your shots. I recommend saving homing missiles for these guys. If you do manage to get all 20 cells, the explosion from them can kill you if you're not careful. I failed this mission about a dozen times. To make this more saddening, Ghen War is an arcade-style game.
That's impossible.
Sonic 2 handles stubborn stains. Embarrassing bald spots, no problem.
To put things into perspective, most of Sega's games were arcade-style. It was the norm. Sonic, Panzer, Streets of Rage, Shinobi, Astal, Clockwork Knight, you can't save. When you lose all your lives, it's game over and start over. Players of the time were used to this and expected it. Saving the game is a relatively new concept. Ghen War starts you out with just 3 lives. Brutally, you're given no continues. There are 19 total missions, and each takes roughly 8 minutes to beat, assuming you know what you're doing. Generously speaking, that's about 3 hours of gameplay for one successful run. This is not counting the hours spent figuring out levels, getting killed, and starting over. Now, since it's a really hard game, you're gonna start over a lot.
When you're testing a game, you're looking to break it.
Leyland says game testers of the mid-90s got really good at video games. Anything a regular gamer would find normal would be too easy for them. So as a result, many of the Saturn's early games got pretty hard.
We were using feedback from the QA departments as to difficulty levels. And let me tell you, that's a nice rookie designer mistake. They're always asking us to ramp up the difficulty level. So some of the games, some of the early games got super hard.
Over the course of the next several years, more companies would instead use focus groups to gauge difficulty, while letting the professional testers find the bugs. The good news, Ghen War does let you save. Sort of. Ghen War autosaves anytime you complete a mission or leave the game. If you exit at the mission accomplished screen, you can turn the game off and continue at a later time with no penalty. The same thing happens at the failure screen when you die and lose a life. Now here's where things get tricky. If you exit in the middle of a mission, you automatically lose a life when you continue later. Ghen War penalizes you for leaving mid-level. Now you might be thinking, if I physically reset the Saturn right when I'm about to die, I can continue with no penalty, right? Wrong. It knows. If you turn off the Saturn mid-level, you lose a life as penalty. Power outages be damned. There's also no 99 lives or level select cheat code. Just one code that gives you invincibility and unlimited ammo. Feels too cheap to use in regular gameplay. The designers, or perhaps publishers, really wanted to be sure that you had to play by these rules. Now you might be thinking, just turn down the difficulty, you big baby. There are 3 difficulty settings, hilariously named Inept, Intense, and Insane. Intense is the default. Inept is much easier, but if you play in this setting, it stops your game when you beat Moon Mission 5, roughly halfway through the game. There is one way to save scum, but it's kind of a pain. When you beat a level, you can copy the save file from the system to a memory cartridge. If you get game over, you can then copy the file from the cartridge back to the system and continue from where you left off. But this involves turning it off every time you beat a level, going back to the system menu, copying files over and over. It's a pain, but it technically works. This strat is especially annoying if you have to use a Sega Saturn cartridge or some kind of region breaker. To save you from frustration, I highly recommend emulating and using save states. You want to have some hardcore gamer moments, then play it raw, like a champ, starting with 3 lives and getting absolutely no continues. In my opinion, Ghen War is way too difficult and long to be an arcade-style experience. Imagine if a longer shooter like Power Slave, Doom, or Halo made you start the game over after losing. It would not be rad. Beating this in one playthrough without losing all your lives is an unreasonable expectation. It would be a much better game if you could save like normal. As Leyland said earlier, it was hard for them to adjust difficulty since professional game testers were also their focus group. For the sake of being able to get through the bulk of it, I save scummed. And I did finally beat Moon Mission 1. While not recording. This is where it gets really interesting. You're inside the halls, rooms, and corridors of an overrun base, restoring power by finding switches, and occasionally getting spooked by the creepy and sneaky aliens. The exploration aspect and puzzles are well designed and fun to play. Close quarter combat is a blast. There's plenty of objects and barriers to take advantage of, and the nearly survival horror aspects of Ghen War stop by to play around. Moonbase is where I really started to see the true potential of what Ghen War could have been. The Grey Rock's final mission is to find and exterminate these giant spiders in action-packed combat. Dropships will fly in and spit out soldiers to keep you on your toes. Leyland specifically noted the arachnids as one of their development highlights.
Greg's brother Eric, who was another programmer, worked with me on the title. Again, he should be in the credits as well. Eric wrote a really simple kind of algorithm for the spider bot movement, the spider enemies movement. And they were so creepy because they looked like spiders. They moved like spiders. They turned to, before they moved, they would turn. So they would turn to face you or turn away and then move.
Once they've been squashed, the plot takes you back to Earth, specifically Australia.
We punch in coordinates for Mount Kosciuszko, Australia.
Most of the humans have been sedated with the implants I mentioned earlier. The Ghen's implant factory is in the outback.
Down under, that outback stuff.
In this part of Ghen War, developers really got going with planting sub-weapons and power-ups for very specific tasks. The goal screen hints at needing a certain type of missile to destroy the Dragon dropship. It requires armor-piercing missiles, which can be found after some mountainside exploration. There's also a force field generator you have to destroy, but there's too many respawning triangle things to get them with the standard shot, so you have to use the nearby rapid-fire power-up to take care of it. After a couple of missions, you get on board an enemy Ghen ship, and are tasked with assassinating its crew from the inside. This is my favorite mission. The combat is challenging yet fair, leaving the player with different possible strategies for taking them on. At the end, you get a bunch of power-ups that let you tear apart swarms of soldiers down this long, dark hallway before getting to the bridge and ripping apart its pilots. The next mission is in Sydney, a close second favorite. This has you jumping from rooftop to rooftop, battling bad guys from up high and on the streets below, while the buildings get blown to bits, leaving behind a path of ruin and collateral damage. Your goal here is simple. Find the armor-piercing missiles and use them to level the implant factory.
You mess this one up, and they'll pull the switch and take the whole planet with them.
The final 4 missions are on NORAD, the Ghen's final base on Earth. 2 massive beasts guard its entrance. One is a giant centipede who takes about a couple dozen hits from the armor-piercing rockets. The other is the same griffin from Moon Mission 1, requiring 20 power cells to kill. Once inside the base, you gotta grind through 2 challenging indoor missions before taking on Commander Xylon himself. Defeat him and you beat the game.
They love me. They really love me.
There's so much potential with Ghen War. The blueprints for its levels, creative goals, and bestiary of alien enemies are well done. But there were so many setbacks from Sega, Hollywood, and Sega that kept the designers away from making this into what it could have been. When designing a video game, there are a certain set of standards set forth by the publisher. These can be simple things like having a start menu. They can also be more complex requirements, like not having certain graphical glitches. A big problem Leyland mentioned is these standards and requirements were not made clear by Sega while designing Ghen War. The quality assurance team, or simply referred to as QA, rejected many alpha versions of Ghen War.
And as we were heading into 95, we're going through this process, and we kept getting bounced back for requirements that we didn't know about before we submitted.
One of the big issues they had were small graphical dropouts in levels.
If you're playing Ghen War and you walk really close to a cave or a mountainside, sometimes you'll see little holes in the terrain at the bottom, like little triangle diamond shapes where you can see where the polygons join, you can see through. We eventually solved it, eventually did figure out what it was. And then like the next month, Sega released the Daytona game.
Gentlemen, start your engines.
Where as soon as you drove near a building, it would drop out and you'd get a big hole and see the background. And I remember going, I just wasted a month of my life solving that problem, and Sega's own products don't do it. It's like, just drive your car right near the edge of the track, and there'll be a giant, enormous, gaping.
While dealing with their hypocrisy and poorly communicated demands, the engine Sega gave them was ass at drawing polygons.
You end up with curved shaped objects like a potato chip rather than a flat polygon. You end up with a weird potato chip shape. And we once we found that out, we tried to use it. So some of the shapes and the characters in Ghen War have odd shaped curvature to them, and that was done sort of kind of using the flaw in their engine to make it look better.
Moments like these were eating up the time they could have spent working on the game. Designing levels, refining the movement and combat controls, and overall getting Ghen War just right. Leyland goes into great detail in our full hour-long interview. Reviewers of the time were very divided and inconsistent. They couldn't really seem to agree on anything. Some said the level designs and goals were good, some thought they were bland and boring, others thought it had great graphics, some thought the graphics sucked. They do all seem to agree on the controls being hard to get used to, but they disagree on if the learning curve is too high. I personally think the controls are fine once you spend a few minutes experimenting with them, but I'm also very used to tank controls, so there's a personal bias there. Overall, scores were mixed across the spectrum. Some loved it, others were and some hated it. While this might not explain the write-ups on Ghen War, Leyland did mention Sega was not as kind to the media as they used to be in the Genesis age. Not telling them about the surprise launch probably didn't help.
A lot of the reviews of Saturn games, I think, got pretty harshly treated because Sony was the media darling. And some of that I feel I can ascribe to Sega's management. But the management attitude, the total attitude, was poor. And so it was really easy for the video game magazines and articles to slam on products. Like the generals of World War I, they were preparing to refight the last battle. And it could clearly win at that. I mean, you could make an awesome-looking Tempest. You could make a fantastic Altered Beast or equivalent type game. One of those ones where they're giant, flat polygons that beat each other up.
It's a more than decent game when you break it down. The level design, enemies, and combat are on point, but its short draw distance, speed, and controls don't keep up with the action, causing frustrating deaths. The betrayal of the Ghen race against the humans is similar to Sega's betrayal on American developers. They gave the West all the tools it needed to make successful Genesis games, but couldn't deliver good resources at the dawn of Saturn.
It's out there.
Certain aspects of it are not only well done, but could be considered revolutionary. It might be the very first fully 3D first-person shooter, definitely predates Quake. Deformable terrain and dynamic music are two things you could barely find in 5th-gen games. More importantly, it showed the people at February's developers conference that the Saturn is capable of full 3D. I firmly believe that Sega's mismanagement is what caused Ghen War to turn out the way it did. This could have been one of the greats, right up there with Power Slave and Duke. But at the end of the day, the end product tragically doesn't live up. More than 20 years later, Ghen War has next to no cultural relevance. It got no sequels and no references in future Sega material. Even the small Saturn fanbase barely talks about it. Like many 1995 Saturn games, Sega printed a lot of copies. This is one of those games you'll constantly find in eBay bulk lots. Since Ghen War, Robert Leyland moved on to lead several third-party games. In recent times, he played a major role in the Toys for Bob Skylanders series, spearheading its revolutionary NFC figurine reader and helping program the games. It all became very commercially successful. In our interview, Leyland told me he retired shortly before Toys for Bob announced the Spyro Trilogy remake. Like the judo flips given to Saturn naysayers, Chairman Segata blew up the Ghen army and strafed his way to the end. The controls of his mech suit may have flaws, his vision obscured by 5th gen darkness, and Sega's shortcomings, but it was still a pretty alright time. What Ghen War needs is a remake. No, I did not stutter. I think this project deserves a second chance. The vision Leyland and the Hammond brothers had can easily be accomplished on modern hardware. A development team could bring back the original script, unaltered by Hollywood producers. Not only could they recreate the same levels and enemies with incredible draw distance, modern controls, and easy-to-use 3D engines, they can make it look stunning. They can expand the levels, add new enemies, maybe even develop the initial vision of Ghen War 2 into a second half of the game. The base of a good game is here. There could have been a great Ghen War with an incredible amount of explosive weapons and creepy alien bad guys. But their vision was made in the wrong time. Now it can be done right, and the original concept is great enough to deserve it.
By preventing us from testing the only possible means of stopping the Bokayad, your species has sealed its doom.
He's gonna make a woman real happy someday. One thing about our interview that really stuck out to me, Robert Leyland thinks the Saturn never truly met its full potential. He thinks the Saturn's ceiling was much higher than the PlayStation's, saying not even later games like Panzer Dragoon Saga used all the Saturn could give.
For all my beefs about the Sega management and actually some of the hardware, some of the issues with the hardware, it was actually a pretty fun machine to program for. As a software developer, it was a blazing fast CPU, and you could really crank it to do tricks. Like the PlayStation, you could get something going on the PlayStation really easily, but you couldn't push it. It had a very kind of fixed end point, whereas the Saturn, there was always more stuff that you could crank on. Like you could dual process, you could use the sound processor to help you out, you could use the video processor to help you out. There was always more things you could get working inside it. And so it was a machine where I don't think anyone actually ever reached the limits of the machine.
Eventually, good 3D engines were programmed, and some of the Saturn's later games looked great. Will this undo the damage dealt to third-party developers? Spoiler alert, no, not really, but I'm still going to spend another 225 episodes talking about it.
Hey, yes, nice job, buddy, very nice.
Hey, nice job, Lieutenant.
Hey, really nice job out there, Lieutenant. I owe you one.
Hey, our intergalactic warrior. Awesome job, dude. Awesome.
Unbelievable. Absolutely unbelievable.
Hey, hold on, you guys. It's not over yet.
Ah! Yeah!